Workers demand rights, businesses want protection, and states are asking for more resources. As the US slowly reopens, lawmakers are at odds over who deserves the most relief.
So much of how we function in meeting the needs of the people depends on state and local governments having the resources.
I would certainly be in favor of allowing states to use the bankruptcy route.
Welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Senators returned to Capitol Hill on Monday amid a growing number of COVID-19 cases in Washington, D.C., and with a lack of testing capacity for the 100 senators and their staff. This over a month after President Trump claimed that anybody that wants a test can get a test. As the death toll continues to climb to more than 70,000 confirmed deaths, and with over 30 million unemployment claims, lawmakers are considering a fourth round of federal aid. With the overwhelming majority of states now gradually reopening their economies, workers who cannot work from home are calling for increased protection. Meanwhile, protests against remaining stay-at-home orders have intensified, with some armed protesters venting their anger at governors who continue to implement these measures. And with hundreds of billions of dollars needed to help state and local governments balance their budgets, federal aid is proving to be a major political sticking point. So will the big corporations or the people prevail, and can the federal government simply allow states to go bankrupt? We now go in depth with the former governor of Pennsylvania, Ed Rendell. He is also a former mayor of Philadelphia and former chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Governor Rendell, first, let me ask you, do you think that states should rush to reopen given the recent White House internal documents that show that the daily death toll could rise to 3,000 as of June 1st?
Well, that certainly confirms the fact that they shouldn't rush to reopen. But even before that, the states should not reopen until they can meet the guidelines put out by the Trump administration, those three-phase guidelines. And most of the states that are reopening haven't met the Trump administration's guidelines to reopen phase one.
Many of them are being praised by President Trump for going ahead with the gradual reopening of their economies. You were in charge of the fifth most populous state in the United States, Pennsylvania. If you were still governor today, how would you react to the kind of harsh criticism that we're hearing from Republicans on the Hill, from the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, and others who are making any federal aid to states who are struggling to make up for the lost tax revenues because of COVID-19, making it contingent on so much else that they need to do?
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with Congress or the federal government saying to the states, here's money to help you pay your workers. But we're going to oversee this to make sure that it goes to pay your workers, not to make up for prior deficits that you've run. So just like businesses should be overseen to make sure that they're not giving the money that the federal government's giving them for stock buybacks or for bonuses for executives.
But do you agree with the strings attached? This is what Mitch McConnell has said.
We'll certainly insist that anything we borrow to send down to the states is not spent on solving problems that they created for themselves over the years with their pension programs.
Quite a harsh warning there from some of the Republicans on the Hill. If you were governor of this important swing state that President Trump won in 2016, Pennsylvania, how would you react?
No, I would say to them, look, I have no problem with those restrictions because we're going to spend this money prospectively, helping to keep our teachers, keep our first responders working. That's what the money is going to be spent for. We're not going to spend it for any past liabilities, any pension fund deficits we have. There's nothing wrong with the federal government attaching strings to the aid that it gives to make sure that that's being used to battle the things that have been caused by the pandemic, any more than attaching strings to aid to corporations. So we don't see them using that money for stock buybacks or for bonuses for executives. Let's use it.
But many people, though, Governor Rendell, would suggest that the president is not just playing politics with this national health crisis, talking about blue states and red states and who deserves the aid and who doesn't. But he's going further than that by making sure that the federal aid only gets sent to governors who will change some of their immigration policies. I mean, this is what President Trump said a few days ago.
Bailouts are very tough, and they happen to be Democrat states. It's California, it's New York, it's Illinois. You start with those three. And the Republican states are in strong shape. You know, I don't know, is that luck or is that talent? It says we're not looking to recover 25 years of bad management and to give them the money that they lost. That's unfair to other states. Now, if it's COVID related, I guess we can talk about it. But we'd want certain things also, including sanctuary city adjustments.
The president is suggesting that some of the federal aid will only be sent to those governors who change their immigration policies to eliminate protections for unauthorized immigrants. Do you agree with this approach?
No, it's ridiculous. You cannot attach political conditions to the money. You never, when I was governor, I never punished cities or counties that didn't vote for me. I gave them the same aid that I gave to counties where I rolled up big margins. You cannot use this for politics. And by the way, the president's dead wrong. Wait till you see what happens in Texas and Georgia. You're already seeing a tremendous spike in states like Iowa. This isn't going to be just blue states. It's going to be all over America. And the aid that's given should be going to help states pay for first responders, for teachers, for people who are important to fighting the pandemic.
But are you saying, though, that some governors, some states are being punished?
There hasn't been any sign of that yet because the money has not been conditioned with things like no sanctuary cities or the right immigration policies. The only conditions that the administration should put on the money and Congress should put on the money is that it be spent only to fight the effects of the pandemic, not to help the states get out of pension liabilities or things like that.
What do you make of the push on Capitol Hill by many Republicans to shield big businesses away from what they say could be an avalanche of lawsuits that could be filed against them once companies reopen and workers are forced to get back to work? Democrats clearly want to put in place protections for workers. Nancy Pelosi herself said this.
We have every reason to protect our workers and our patients and all of this. So we would not be inclined to be supporting any immunity from liability.
So who prevails in this fight? The big corporations and their powerful backers in the White House, or workers who are looking for additional protections?
The only time I think I would give corporation immunity is if the federal government forced it to go back to work. If it was a federal order under the Defense Protection Act that forced the company to do certain things, then I would, like, for example, ordering the meat companies to go back in and open up their plants again. That's going to happen because the president issued an executive order to that effect. There should be immunity attached to when a company is being asked to go back to work under the act. But when a company goes back to work under its own volition, to say that there's blanket protection is ridiculous.
Well, there's already been a lawsuit at a meatpacking factory where workers say that they've not been provided with sufficient personal protective equipment, and they have been forced to work shoulder to shoulder, and they were not provided sufficient time and opportunities to wash their hands.
Of course, that lawsuit should not be thrown out by blanket immunity. If a corporation willfully disregards the basic things that are necessary for the safety of their workers during a pandemic, they ought to be held accountable for that.
The current governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf, a Democrat, has been reluctant to criticize President Trump, perhaps knowing full well that that could have serious repercussions. I know you know President Trump. You've dealt with him for many, many years. How would you rate his response to this pandemic? He has been giving himself and his administration high marks. Do you agree? Should he self-congratulate?
Well, put it this way, F is not a low enough mark for the administration's response. They blew it by doing nothing in January, doing nothing mostly in February. They blew it by the president coming on and minimizing it, saying it would be 15 people and then down to 1. Or when the hot, warm weather arrives in April, the virus is going to go away. In fact, they're still blowing it Vice President Pence just said this will be gone by Memorial Day. Well, Mr. Vice President, look at the CDC report from yesterday. We're going to double the amount of Americans dying by Memorial Day. It's not going to be gone. Get real. Start dealing with the health consequences for the people of this country and start directing them in the right way, not the wrong way, not the political way.
So you'd give them a failing mark?
F is not low enough.
Former Governor Ed Rendell, thank you very much indeed.
We want to get our country open, and the testing is not going to be a problem at all.
While President Trump continues to boast about the country's testing capacity, states and health officials across the US report a different reality. Unequal access to testing kits and bidding wars among governors, with some even getting the medical supplies they need from abroad. So then, do we have a clear picture of where the country stands and how resources are being distributed? Let's put this in focus with Craig Fugate, the former administrator for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which has been tapped to oversee the coordination of medical supplies. Mr. Fugate, the day after President Trump projected that the death toll from COVID-19 would not exceed 50 or 60,000 in late April, FEMA ordered an additional 100,000 body bags. Why this discrepancy between the president's public statements and FEMA? Are they reading from the same script?
Well, FEMA's job is not to prepare for what can happen, it's to prepare for worst case scenarios. So while other people are projecting what may happen, FEMA has to look at the worst case scenarios.
And FEMA, of course, is not usually the go-to agency for this sort of thing. It deals typically with hurricanes, with floods, with wildfires. This is new. I know that during your time as administrator under President Obama, you dealt with over 900 disaster declarations. How different, though, is this, and how well equipped is FEMA to deal with a national health crisis of this magnitude?
Well, it's not just FEMA. If you think about most disasters, they're geographically located in an area, and we can pull resources from all over the world, all over the country. But with a pandemic, everybody's impacted at the same time. And this was part of our planning when we looked at H1N1, as we dealt with plans for our other pandemics, was the traditional model would not work. We would not be able to send mutual aid all over the country at the time people needed it, because too many areas would be impacted at the same time.
Well, you rightly point out that it's not just FEMA. Some would argue that there are too many cooks in the kitchen. It is not quite clear who is doing what. I mean, some suggest that the president's own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is leading some kind of a back channel with this project known as Project Airbridge, where he has brought in the biggest 6 medical distribution companies in the country. And those companies have been flying in supplies from China. The cost of the shipment has been underwritten by the federal government, in return, though, for the government deciding where half the supplies go. Is this the way it should work?
Well, it's what they're doing. I mean, our plans would basically be to support the Center for Disease Control and have the health experts leading this, with FEMA providing assistance. That's what we did during Ebola, and that's what our plan was for future pandemics.
What do you say to those who believe that FEMA today is showing an opaqueness? The chairs of the committees on oversight and reform and homeland security have criticized FEMA. They say the agency's opaque and evolving processes are clearly not meeting the needs that communities have right now for PPE, personal protective equipment, and medical supplies. Without full disclosure, do we know what equipment and what medical supplies are going where, and what kind of criteria is being used to determine who gets what?
Well, to be fair, I think FEMA can only be as transparent as the administration is willing to be transparent. And I think Congress does have oversight responsibilities to get these questions answered.
But clearly, I mean, we heard the spokesman from the agency say they have no authority to actually divulge any of the information that could let us know how much of this is being distributed to which states. What do you make of this unwillingness on their part, perhaps under political pressure from the White House?
Well, again, if the administration doesn't want to be transparent, FEMA's not in a position to provide that information. I can only tell you that when we worked in the Obama administration, we try to be as transparent as possible, good, bad, and the ugly. So We didn't find much profit in holding back information. We felt people had to have the right information to make informed decisions.
And yet, despite all of this, the administration is constantly telling the public what a great job it's been doing. This is how Jared Kushner himself described the federal response so far.
This is a great success story, and I think that that's really, what needs to be told.
Is that really what needs to be told, or is there much more to it?
My experience, you do your job, and if you get good press, great. But you don't go around telling people how great you are when people are dying.
And how much is politics driving this whole debate and what is going on between the federal government and the states? Because we learned recently that Republican governors, for example, the governor of Florida has said that he's received everything he's asked for. That has not always been the case for Democrat-run states. Do you agree?
Well, when I was at FEMA, we made our decisions based upon need, not affiliations or politics. What is happening today, again, I would defer back to this administration. They do not have a lot of transparency, so it's hard to say how much political decisions have influenced where things go.
Are you surprised, though, that the governor of the state of Maryland had to go to South Korea to order 500,000 masks, for example, and then when he did receive them, he had to call on the National Guard and the police of his own state to safeguard them?
Well, again, I've seen things in this response I have never seen before. Why it's happening is hard to say.
Craig Fugate, a former administrator of FEMA, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
President Trump has repeatedly called it a war against an invisible enemy, describing himself as a war president.
It's called the invisible enemy, and that's what it is. It's an invisible enemy. We have to fight that invisible enemy. We have to win this war, and ideally quickly. But if you remember, when I first came in, we didn't have ammunition. Not a good way to fight a war. America continues to wage an all-out medical war to defeat the invisible enemy.
COVID-19 has now taken more American lives than the wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq combined. With Trump labeling himself a wartime president, is this a war the commander-in-chief can win? And how will this pandemic shift America's national security priorities? Joining me now is General Richard Myers, who served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the George W. Bush administration. General Myers, a big question which isn't often looked at is how do you keep armed forces safe from the coronavirus when physical distancing really isn't an option in barracks, on Navy ships, on submarines? And there are reports that all but one US nuclear bases have been affected. We also know what happened when the commanding officer of the US carrier, the Theodore Roosevelt, sounded the alarm bell asking for help after the outbreak of the virus on his ship. How do you keep the armed forces safe from the coronavirus? How do you fight this pandemic when, after all, there is also strong evidence to suggest that the 1918-1920 so-called Spanish flu actually originated in the army barracks of your home state, Kansas?
Right. So, Ghida, that's a great question. That's probably the number one operational question for our armed forces right now is how to stay safe, given all the things that you mentioned in terms of military business is a business where we're all close together, whether it's on a ship or in a tank or on the battlefield or airplane or whatever. It's very tough. So I don't think things change for our military. I think you still have to follow the guidance that we know will flatten the curve.
But what will this mean for the US military around the world? Will it be business as usual or not? This is what the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has said.
There's significant stress as a result of this COVID-19 virus on the politics, internal politics of other countries. There's significant stress on their economies, on resources. There's an increased probability, or at least a risk, of instability, significant instability in some countries. So no, it's not going to be business as usual. We've got to take a hard look at how we as a military, we as a Department of Defense, conduct operations in the future.
What does this mean to you, though? What does it mean it will not be business as usual? Will we see fewer US military interventions? When you took over barely a month into your term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the US launched its invasion of Afghanistan, and it ushered in this new era, the so-called 9/11, post-9/11 era, with trillions of dollars wasted or spent on the war on terror. Will we see things changing, a shift in the paradigm, not just for the United States, but around the world too, in the way the military conducts business?
Well, I think the chairman's right that with this worldwide pandemic, the impact it's going to have on peoples around the world, that it may change the security picture. People, we talked about starvation can change the security picture if you have starvation in certain parts of the world. This is a disease and economic impact that goes along with it, a big economic impact. So I think the chairman's absolutely right. And I think that U.S. military is going to have to position for that. I think what's key, though, and strategically, now we talked about the operational impact on our military. I think the strategic imperative now is to realize that no one country can solve this pandemic by itself, just like we can't solve pollution issues, environmental issues. We have to be in this together. We have to have, it demands partnerships, and the military has been very good at developing partnerships. And if you're going to have partnerships, those relationships and partnerships have to be based on trust. So there's a lot to lose if we don't do things right going forward in terms of building these partnerships that will, in the end, help people around the world. That's, I think, what people will look to the U.S. military to do, not just to suppress conflict if that happens, but to be helpful in avoiding conflict.
And to focus on the kind of damage that a single pathogen, a single virus can cause. And when you put things in context, the 15 years of the Vietnam War cost some 58,200 American lives. In April alone, almost 59,000 American lives were lost. So do you think that the infinite defense spending and budget needs to be reassessed and more needs to be spent on global health? Because as it stands today, the US military is spending for 2020 roughly $934 billion, and the combined annual budgets of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Institute of Health, and the annual US contributions to the World Health Organization together equal just 7% of the annual Pentagon budget, just 7%.
So I think there's a lot of things that can be done budget-wise that will have to be done. Budget-wise, I think this pandemic's pointed out that the ones that have the shallowest safety net, if you will, are going to suffer the most. So there are a lot of things that can be done, whether it's rebalancing out of the defense budget or not, I don't know. There's a lot of other threats in the world that would dictate we have a fairly strong defense budget. But clearly budgets are going to have to change to address the health of not only the United States, but the world health as we think about this pandemic. I go back to the point, no one nation can solve this. No one defense budget's going to solve this as large as the U.S. defense budget is. This is everybody in this together. And that's the part that I think we need to see more of, is see the collaboration and the sense of partnership between nations as we try to thwart the effects of this pandemic.
But clearly that is not what we're seeing, General Myers. If anything, we're seeing a very hawkish tone by the Trump administration, the president himself, his Secretary of State, Pompeo, towards not just Iran, towards China as well, an increasingly partisan tone as well here in the United States. Your former boss, George W. Bush, saying we're not partisan combatants, we are human beings equally vulnerable. So both domestically, is this the right tone that is being struck by the administration? And internationally, should the United States be taking on this increasingly threatening tone towards major powers like China?
I think the tone should be, how do we bring nations together to deal with this pandemic? It's not going to be dealt with one nation at a time. The weakest link can make us all vulnerable. So somehow we have to figure out how to do this in a very collaborative way, in a very open way, where we share our knowledge and our hope.
So what do you make, very briefly, of the coordinated attack that seems to be launched against China and its Communist Party, and suggestions that the virus was designed in the Wuhan virology lab, even though the intelligence community here in the United States and the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, has refuted this?
So I'll leave that to the experts. Everybody can be faulted in this, right? You can fault China for not reacting quick enough, for not informing us fast enough. We have our own issues here in the United States. We're still waiting for adequate testing here in the state of Kansas. I mean, there's all sorts of, but that's interesting. But I'd like to look forward and try to figure out how we, as a world, dependent on one another in more ways than we've ever been dependent, how can we figure out how we can work together?
General Richard Myers, great pleasure to have you. Thank you very much. And so, in short, while President Trump perseveres in self-congratulations, he's being compelled to revise upward the lethality of the pandemic in the United States. But his focus is on reopening the economy rather than investing in saving American lives. The latest projections put the death toll at around 140,000. To state the obvious, Trump's priority is his re-election, but recent polls are said to have infuriated him. He knows that the only path to another 4 years at the White House is jump-starting the economy at an extraordinary cost. The US national debt has reached $25 trillion, and the debt-to-GDP ratio is over 100%. And with the US Federal Reserve now printing dollars at will, a larger structural crisis may well be ahead of us. And while Trump lashes out at China, China in turn holds more and more US debt, a leverage it could still choose to use. Let us know what you think. Send us your thoughts, questions, and comments at _Inside America. From me and the team, thanks for watching.